My name is Serafina Vale, and I'm 28 years old. Last Saturday, I stood in the back of my father's wedding reception, wearing a black uniform, while guests whispered about the help. What they didn't know was that I owned 40% of his multi-million-dollar tech empire. What I didn't know was that this humiliation would be the final catalyst that would destroy everything he'd built, expose decades of lies, and reveal a family secret so shocking it would make national headlines within 72 hours. Before we dive into this wild family revenge story, let me know where you're watching from. If you're ready for a tale of betrayal, justice, and the sweetest karma you've ever heard, smash that like button and subscribe because this story has more twists than a pretzel factory. Trust me, you won't want to miss how this unfolds. The whole nightmare started 3 months earlier when my father, Marcus Vale, announced his engagement to Vivian Blackwood, a woman barely 5 years older than me. I should have seen the red flags then, but I was drowning in my own problems. My mother had died 2 years prior from cancer, and I'd been managing both my grief and my secret. The fact that I'd been the anonymous investor who'd saved Dad's company from bankruptcy when I was just 25. See, when Mom was dying, she'd told me something that changed everything. She'd inherited a substantial trust fund from her grandmother, money that Dad never knew about. With her blessing, I'd used that inheritance to purchase shares in Vale Technologies through a shell corporation called Meridian Holdings. The paperwork was so complex and buried so deep in legal documents that Dad had no idea his own daughter was his largest private investor. "I want you to see what kind of man your father really is when money's involved," Mom had whispered during one of our last conversations. "Promise me you'll keep this secret until the right moment comes." I'd kept that promise, watching from the shadows as Dad rebuilt his company using my money, taking all the credit, giving interviews about his incredible comeback and self-made success. It stung, but I told myself I was honoring Mom's wishes. The wedding planning should have been my first warning. Instead of asking me to be a bridesmaid, or even acknowledging me as his daughter in the ceremony, Dad announced that I'd be helping with service during the reception. When I protested, Vivian chimed in with that sickeningly sweet voice of hers. "Oh, Serafina honey, we thought it would be perfect since you're so practical. Plus, it'll save us money on catering staff." Dad just nodded along, avoiding eye contact. "It makes sense, Sarah. You know how tight things have been." Tight. The man was worth $12 million and $8 million of that came from my investment. But I bit my tongue and agreed, thinking maybe I could use the opportunity to observe their guests, particularly the business associates Dad had been courting for a major merger. The wedding day itself was a spectacle of excess. Vivian had spared no expense. Ice sculptures, imported flowers, a 7-tier cake that cost more than most people's cars. I arrived early in my black server's uniform, complete with a name tag that simply read, "Housekeeper," and started setting up the reception area. That's when I overheard the conversation that changed everything. I was arranging centerpieces near the bar when I heard Dad's voice drifting from the coat check room. He was talking to someone on the phone, probably thinking he was alone. No, you don't understand," he was saying, his voice tight with stress. "The Meridian Holdings shares can't be traced back to me. I've been reporting them as an anonymous investor to avoid the audit triggers." My blood ran cold. Meridian Holdings. That was my shell company. "Look, Richard," Dad continued, "once this merger goes through with Peterson Industries, I'm buying back those Meridian shares at 15% below market value. The anonymous investor won't have a choice but to sell. It's all in the fine print of the original agreement." I nearly dropped the vase I was holding. There was no such clause in my investment agreement. I'd read every word of that contract dozens of times. "I know it's technically fraud," Dad laughed, "but who's going to report me? Some faceless investment group. By the time they figure out what happened, I'll own 100% of Vale Technologies again, and the Peterson deal will make me worth $50 million. The person on the other end said something I couldn't hear, but Dad's response made my stomach drop. "Trust me, if anyone tries to challenge this, I've got lawyers who'll tie them up in court for years. Besides, I've been laying groundwork for months. I've got documentation showing the Meridian investor violated several terms of the agreement, all fabricated of course, but it'll hold up long enough for me to complete the buyback." I backed away slowly, my hands shaking. Not only was my father planning to steal my shares, but he was actively committing fraud to do it. The Peterson Industries merger that he'd been bragging about for months wasn't just a business opportunity, it was the final step in robbing me of millions of dollars. As I processed this betrayal, pieces started falling into place. The rushed wedding timeline. Vivian's sudden appearance in his life right around the time the merger talks began. The way Dad had been pushing me to find my own path and move out of the family home. I spent the rest of the ceremony in a daze, mechanically serving champagne and canapes while my mind raced. Every smile from Dad, every air kiss from Vivian, every congratulation from guests who saw me as just another member of the service staff, it all felt like a knife twisting deeper. During the father-daughter dance that never included me, I watched Dad spin Vivian around the dance floor while I collected dirty plates in the background. He caught my eye once and had the audacity to wink at me as if we were sharing some inside joke about my role in his special day. That's when the last piece of my naivety crumbled. This wasn't just about money or business. This was about a man who'd systematically erased his own daughter from his life story. I'd been grieving my mother, honoring her memory by secretly supporting the family business, while my father was actively plotting to rob me blind. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, I found myself in the kitchen stacking dirty dishes and listening to the catering staff gossip about the weird family dynamics they'd observed. One of them, a woman named Rosa who'd worked dozens of high-end events, pulled me aside. "Honey," she said quietly, "I've been doing this for 15 years and I've never seen a father treat his daughter like hired help at his own wedding. That man's got darkness in him." She was right, and I realized that Mom's final gift hadn't just been the money. It had been the foresight to protect me from discovering this truth too late. She'd known exactly what kind of man Dad was, and she'd given me the tools to fight back. That night, as I drove home still wearing my housekeeper uniform, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to be a victim of my father's greed and manipulation. I was going to destroy him with the same methodical precision he'd used to erase me. The morning after Dad's wedding, I sat in my apartment staring at 3 years' worth of Meridian Holdings documentation spread across my dining table like evidence in a murder trial. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but I was too focused to care. Every email, every bank transfer, every legal document told the same story. I'd been funding my own father's success while he planned to rob me blind. But now I had something he didn't know about: a recording. See, when I'd overheard that damning phone conversation at the wedding, my phone had been in my apron pocket and I'd had the presence of mind to hit record. 47 minutes of Dad admitting to fraud, conspiracy, and his plan to steal my shares through fabricated legal violations. It was enough to send him to prison, but prison wasn't what I wanted. I wanted him to feel exactly what I'd felt standing in that reception hall, wearing a name tag that reduced me to hired help while he celebrated with my money. My first call was to Elena Rodriguez, a forensic accountant I'd met during Mom's cancer treatment. Elena's husband had been in the same oncology ward, and we'd bonded over midnight vending machine coffee and shared exhaustion. What Dad didn't know was that Elena specialized in corporate fraud and had built her reputation tearing apart white-collar criminals. Serafina, Elena's voice was sharp with interest when I explained the situation. "Forward me everything. The recordings, the investment documents, all of it. If your father's been misrepresenting your ownership to potential merger partners, we're looking at securities fraud, which is federal." While Elena began her digital investigation, I started phase 2 of my plan. I needed to understand exactly how deep Dad's deception ran, and that meant getting inside Veil Technologies' systems. Fortunately, as the daughter of the CEO, I'd had building access and security codes my entire adult life. Dad had never bothered to revoke them because in his mind I was just his grieving daughter who helped out occasionally with filing. That Tuesday evening, I walked into Veil Technologies' headquarters wearing a simple business suit and carrying a laptop bag. The night security guard Tommy had known me since I was 16. "Hey there, Miss Vale, working late like your old man, something like that?" I smiled, signing the visitor log with steady hands. "Just need to grab some files from Dad's office." The elevator ride to the executive floor felt like ascending to a battlefield. I'd been in Dad's office countless times over the years, but tonight it felt different. Tonight I wasn't his daughter. I was an investor protecting her assets. Dad's computer was password protected, but he'd always been creature of habit. Mom's maiden name plus his birth year had been his password for everything since I was a child. Within minutes, I was inside his email system, and what I found there made my blood boil all over again. Emails to Peterson Industries, executives describing Meridian Holdings as a problematic anonymous investor with questionable compliance history. Messages to his lawyer discussing legal strategies for involuntary share buybacks. Most damning of all, a draft press release announcing Vail Technologies' return to family ownership, scheduled for the week after the Peterson merger closed. But the worst discovery was in a folder labeled personal. Email after email to Vivian dating back 8 months before Mom's death, talking about eliminating complications and securing the legacy. There were photos, intimate messages, and discussion of wedding plans that predated Mom's funeral by 6 weeks. My father hadn't just planned to rob me. He'd been cheating on my dying mother, while plotting to erase me from the family business entirely. I printed everything, uploaded copies to a secure cloud server, and sent duplicates to Elena. But I wasn't done. If Dad wanted to play dirty, I was going to show him just how thorough his practical daughter could be. My next stop was the executive assistant pool. Dad's secretary, Margaret, had worked for the company for 12 years and had always treated me with genuine kindness. She was usually gone by 7 p.m., but her desk held the one thing I needed most: access to Dad's calendar and contact database. The Peterson Industries merger was scheduled to close in 3 weeks. Dad's timeline was aggressive, probably because he knew the longer he waited, the higher the chance someone would discover his fraud. But those 3 weeks were exactly what I needed. I began making a list of every business contact, every board member, every investor who had dealings with Vail Technologies. Each name represented a potential ally or witness to Dad's crimes. But more importantly, they represented an audience for what was coming. The final stop on my office tour was the company's legal department. Dad's lawyer, Richard Chen, the same Richard he'd been talking to during that recorded phone call, kept physical files in a cabinet that I'd seen him access dozens of times during family visits. The lock was old-fashioned, and I'd learned to pick simple locks during a rebellious teenage phase that Dad had dismissed as Sarah going through a tomboy stage. Inside Chen's files, I found the smoking gun that would make my revenge perfect. Not only did the files contain the fabricated violation notices Dad planned to use against Meridian Holdings, but they also contained something even more valuable: documentation showing that Dad had been systematically undervaluing Vail Technologies and financial reports to minimize tax obligations. The same company he claimed was worth $50 million post-merger had been valued at barely $20 million in tax filings just 6 months earlier. Tax evasion, securities fraud, and conspiracy to commit theft. Dad hadn't just planned to steal from me. He'd been stealing from the government for years. As I left Vail Technologies that night, I felt a calm I hadn't experienced since Mom's death. For the first time in 3 years, I had a clear purpose and the tools to achieve it. Dad had spent months planning my financial destruction, but he'd made one critical error. He'd underestimated his practical daughter's capacity for strategic thinking. Over the next week, I became a ghost in my father's world. I attended family dinners and smiled at Vivian's stories about honeymoon planning. I nodded along when Dad complained about problematic investors slowing down the merger timeline. I even helped Vivian pick out furniture for the house they were planning to buy after the Peterson deal closed. All the while, Elena was building an airtight case. The IRS fraud hotline had been very interested in Dad's tax evasion evidence. The SEC was opening a preliminary investigation into the Peterson merger based on the misrepresentations we'd documented. And most satisfying of all, I'd been in contact with Meridian Holdings' attorney, myself operating through a law firm Elena had recommended, about challenging the upcoming share buyback. Dad thought he was 3 weeks away from the perfect crime. What he didn't know was that he was 3 weeks away from losing everything he'd spent his life building, and I was going to make sure he lost it all in the most public, humiliating way possible. The beauty of revenge, I'd learned, lies not in the moment of destruction but in the careful cultivation of inevitability. Over the next 10 days, I watched Dad transform from confident predator to increasingly anxious businessman as small, seemingly unrelated complications began derailing his perfect plan. It started with Elena's masterpiece, A forensic audit request submitted to Peterson Industries by an anonymous whistleblower concerned about irregularities in Vail Technologies' financial reporting. The request was so professionally crafted and legally sound that Peterson's legal team had no choice but to investigate before proceeding with the merger. Dad burst into family dinner that Thursday looking like he'd aged 5 years in 5 days. Some corporate spy is trying to sabotage the Peterson deal, he announced, stabbing his stake with unnecessary violence. They've got Peterson's lawyers crawling through every financial document from the past 3 years. Vivian, ever the supportive new wife, reached across the table to pat his hand. I'm sure it's just routine, honey. Don't all big mergers involve this kind of scrutiny? Not like this, Dad muttered. They're asking about shareholder disclosure, investment documentation, tax filings. Someone's feeding them very specific information. I kept my expression sympathetic while internally celebrating. Elena had done exactly what I'd asked. Created enough legal pressure to slow the merger without revealing our true purpose. Every day of delay gave us more time to build our case, and more importantly, gave Dad more time to make mistakes. And mistakes he was making. Lots of them. The first crack in his composure came when Richard Chen called during dessert. Dad stepped away to take the call in his study, but the house's old ventilation system carried voices better than he realized. What do you mean the Meridian documentation doesn't match? Dad's voice carried clear panic. We created those violation notices specifically to trigger the buyback clause. I exchanged glances with Vivian, who was pretending not to listen while clearly hanging on every word. No, Richard, you can't just revise the paperwork. If there's a discrepancy, they'll investigate the entire agreement. A long pause. What do you mean they're already investigating? When Dad returned to the dining room, his face was pale and his hands were shaking slightly. Sorry about that. Just some routine legal paperwork for the merger. But Vivian wasn't stupid. Over the following days, I watched her carefully observe Dad's increasing stress levels, his midnight phone calls, his sudden interest in offshore banking. She'd married him for his money and stability, not for whatever chaos was now consuming his business life. My opportunity to plant seeds of doubt came during our bonding shopping trip that Saturday. Vivian had suggested we spend the day together getting to know each other better now that we're family, which I suspected was really about pumping me for information about Dad's business troubles. Your father seems so stressed lately, she said, over lunch at an upscale bistro. Is this normal for big business deals? Oh, this is nothing compared to what happened 3 years ago, I replied, mixing truth with strategic manipulation. Dad almost lost the company entirely. Had to bring in some mysterious investor to save him from bankruptcy. I never did find out who that was. Vivian's perfectly manicured eyebrows rose with interest. A mysterious investor. That sounds intriguing. Dad's always been secretive about money. I continued watching her reaction carefully. Even Mom never knew the full extent of his business dealings. She used to joke that she'd probably discover he had secret bank accounts in Switzerland or something. The comment was designed to trigger Vivian's gold digger instincts, and it worked perfectly. I could practically see the wheels turning in her head as she considered the possibility that her new husband might be hiding assets from her. Has he ever mentioned this investor to you recently? She asked, trying to sound casual. Not directly, but I heard him on the phone with his lawyer talking about buying back some shares from an anonymous investor. Sounded like it was going to make him incredibly wealthy. I leaned forward conspiratorially. Between you and me, I think that's why he's so stressed. This Peterson merger is supposed to fund some major stock purchase that'll make him sole owner of the company again. Vivian's eyes lit up with greed. Sole owner, how much would that be worth? If the merger goes through, probably $60 or $70 million. I let that number sink in. Of course, that's assuming he can actually force this anonymous investor to sell their shares. That evening, I received a text from an unknown number. This is Vivian. Can we meet for coffee? Tomorrow I have some questions about your father's business. Perfect. Dad's new wife was about to become my unwitting ally. Our coffee meeting the next morning was a masterclass in strategic information warfare. Vivian arrived looking perfectly put together but with an underlying tension that suggested she'd spent the night researching corporate law and investor rights. I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, she began carefully. About this anonymous investor. Do you think there might be legal complications if your father tries to force them to sell? I'm not a lawyer, I said truthfully, but from what I understand about corporate law, investors have pretty strong protections, especially if they think they're being defrauded or coerced. Vivian's face went pale. Defrauded? Well, if someone bought shares in good faith and then the company owner tried to force them out using fabricated legal violations, that would probably constitute fraud, right? I sipped my latte innocently. I mean, that's the kind of thing that could result in criminal charges. Criminal charges? Vivian's voice was barely a whisper. Securities fraud is a federal crime. People go to prison for that kind of thing. And if they're married, their spouse could lose everything too, even if they weren't directly involved. I watched Vivian process the implications. She'd married Dad thinking she was securing a luxurious lifestyle with a successful businessman. The possibility that her new husband might be a white-collar criminal facing federal prosecution was clearly not part of her fairy tale ending. Of course, I continued, I'm sure Dad would never do anything illegal. He's always been so careful about following proper procedures. But even as I said it, we both knew it wasn't true. Vivian had been living with Dad for 3 months. She'd seen the late-night phone calls, the stress, the secretive meetings with lawyers. She was starting to realize she might have married a man whose house of cards was about to collapse. That night, Elena called with an update that made my week complete. The IRS is officially investigating Veil Technologies for tax evasion, she reported. And here's the beautiful part. They're also looking into your father's personal finances because the corporate discrepancies suggest possible unreported income. What does that mean for the Peterson merger? Peterson Industries just announced they're postponing the merger pending resolution of ongoing regulatory investigations. Your father's timeline just got blown to pieces. I hung up the phone and allowed myself a moment of pure satisfaction. Dad's perfect plan was unraveling exactly as I'd orchestrated. The merger delay meant he couldn't fund his illegal share buyback. The IRS investigation meant his financial assets were about to be frozen, and his new wife was starting to realize she'd married a potential felon. But I wasn't finished yet. Dad still thought he was dealing with separate, unrelated problems. He had no idea that his practical daughter was the architect of his destruction. The next phase would reveal the truth in the most devastating way possible. And I was going to make sure the whole world was watching when it happened. You're probably wondering how this could possibly get any worse for dear old Dad, right? Well, buckle up because what happens next will blow your mind. The pieces I'd been carefully moving into place were about to create a perfect storm that would expose not just his crimes, but secrets that went back decades. Stay tuned to see how this house of cards finally comes crashing down. The final phase began on a Tuesday morning when Dad received the call that would shatter his world. I was having breakfast in his kitchen. A deliberate choice to witness the moment his empire began crumbling, when his phone rang at exactly 8:15 a.m. Marcus Vale speaking. He answered, his voice still carrying traces of the confidence that had sustained him through 3 weeks of mounting pressure. I watched his face transform as the caller spoke. The color drained from his cheeks, his hand began trembling, and his eyes darted around the room like a trapped animal seeking escape. What do you mean the SEC is freezing all company assets pending investigation? His voice cracked on the last word. You can't just freeze everything without warning. Vivian looked up from her yoga mat in the living room, her face a mask of growing alarm. She'd been distant since our coffee conversation, clearly reevaluating her life choices, but this was the first time she was hearing about federal intervention. Dad listened for another minute, his face growing ashen. A whistleblower complaint. What whistleblower? Who would have access to that kind of detailed financial information? The irony was delicious. Dad was literally asking who could have provided the evidence while sitting 10 feet away from the person who'd orchestrated his downfall. No, Richard, I can't come to your office right now because I'm pretty sure it's about to be raided by federal agents. Dad's composure finally shattered completely. Fix this, that's what I pay you for. He hung up and immediately dialed another number. Peterson, it's Marcus. Please tell me you're not backing out of the merger over some bureaucratic nonsense. The conversation that followed was brutal to witness. Peterson Industries CEO calmly explained that they were terminating all merger discussions effective immediately due to serious concerns about Veil Technologies' corporate governance and financial transparency. The company that was supposed to make Dad worth $50 million had just publicly declared him too toxic to do business with. Honey, Vivian's voice was small and uncertain. What's happening? Dad looked at his new wife with something approaching hatred. What's happening, Vivian, is that someone has been systematically sabotaging everything I've built. Someone with inside knowledge of my business operations and access to confidential information. His eyes fell on me, and for the first time since this began, I saw suspicion flicker across his face. Sarah, how much do you know about my business dealings? I met his gaze, steadily letting a small smile play at the corners of my mouth. More than you might think, Dad. The silence that followed was deafening. Dad's phone began ringing again. Probably reporters given how quickly financial news traveled, but he ignored it, staring at me with growing understanding. It was you. It wasn't a question. It was me. I stood up slowly, savoring the moment I'd been planning for months. Did you really think you could steal 40% of your own company from your daughter and face no consequences? Vivian gasped from across the room. 40%. Serafina owns 40% of Veil Technologies. Meet Meridian Holdings, I said, pulling out my phone and opening the banking app that showed my corporate account balance. The anonymous investor who saved Dad's company from bankruptcy 3 years ago. The same investor he's been planning to defraud out of millions of dollars. Dad's face went through a spectacular range of emotions: shock, rage, disbelief, and finally a kind of grudging respect that made my skin crawl. Your mother's money, he said quietly. She always was smarter than she let on. Mom knew exactly what kind of man you were, I replied. She just wanted to make sure I learned it too at the right time. So, what now, Sarah? You destroy the family business out of spite, you realize you're bankrupting yourself too. That's when I played my final card. I pulled out a second phone and hit play on the recording I'd made at his wedding. His own voice filled the kitchen, crystal clear and undeniably damning. I know it's technically fraud, but who's going to report me? Some faceless investment group. Vivian's face went white as Dad's recorded voice continued, detailing his plans for fabricated legal violations and forced share buybacks. When the recording ended, the silence was broken only by the sound of Dad's phone buzzing with what I assumed were increasingly frantic calls from his lawyer. You recorded me at my own wedding, Dad's voice was barely controlled rage. I recorded you admitting to multiple felonies while I was serving drinks in a housekeeper uniform because you were too cheap and cruel to acknowledge your own daughter at your wedding. My voice stayed calm despite the fury building in my chest. Did you really think there would be no consequences for treating your child like hired help while planning to steal her inheritance? Vivian suddenly stood up, her yoga mat forgotten. I need to call my lawyer. Good idea, I said. You might want to ask about prenuptial agreements and spousal liability for federal crimes. She fled the room and I heard her car start in the driveway moments later. Dad's second marriage was already over, just like his business empire. The IRS has frozen all your personal assets pending their investigation into tax evasion, I continued conversationally. The SEC is investigating you for securities fraud. Peterson Industries has terminated the merger and issued a public statement distancing themselves from your questionable business practices. And in about an hour, every major financial news outlet is going to receive copies of your recorded confession, along with 3 years of documented evidence showing how you've been defrauding investors and evading taxes. Dad slumped into his chair, looking older than his 62 years. How long have you been planning this? Since the moment you handed me a name tag that said, Housekeeper, instead of daughter. I picked up my purse, preparing to leave. But really, Dad, you planned this yourself. I just made sure you got exactly what you deserved. What happens now? Now you face the consequences of your choices. The FBI should be here within the hour to execute search warrants. Richard Chen's office is being raided as we speak. Elena's forensic accounting work was very thorough. I paused at the kitchen door. Oh, and Dad, Veil Technologies will survive this. As the majority shareholder, I'll be restructuring the company under new leadership. Your employees won't lose their jobs because of your crimes. You're 40%, not majority. I smiled, the coldest smile of my life. Check your math, Dad. When a corporate officer is under federal investigation for fraud, their shares can be held in trust pending criminal proceedings. Elena's law firm has already petitioned the court for temporary control of your 60%, citing the need to protect investor interests. As of this morning, I have voting control of 100% of Vail Technologies. The look of absolute devastation on his face was worth every sleepless night I'd spent planning this moment. As I walked out of the house where I'd grown up, Dad's phone was ringing nonstop. The financial news had broken, and the whole world was about to learn about Marcus Vail's spectacular downfall. The media frenzy that followed Dad's exposure exceeded even my most optimistic expectations. By noon, Vail Technologies was trending on social media, financial news networks were running hour-by-hour updates, and my phone was buzzing with interview requests from everyone from Forbes to local television stations. I watched the coverage from Elena's office, surrounded by boxes of evidence that had taken months to compile. Seeing Dad's mugshot flash across CNN while reporters detailed his elaborate scheme to defraud his own daughter felt surreal, like watching a movie about someone else's life. Marcus Vail, CEO of Vail Technologies, was arrested this morning on federal charges including securities, fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy to commit theft, the anchor announced. In a shocking twist, the primary victim of Vail's alleged crimes appears to be his own daughter, Serafina Vail, who had secretly invested millions in her father's company through a shell corporation. Elena muted the television and turned to me with a satisfied grin. The FBI raid went exactly as planned. They seized all of his computers, financial records, and found the fabricated legal documents in Richard Chen's office. Chen's already cooperating with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. What about Vivian filed for divorce this morning and hired a very expensive lawyer to argue she had no knowledge of her husband's criminal activities? Smart woman, actually. Her prenup is solid and she's likely to walk away with only the assets she brought into the marriage. I felt no sympathy for Vivian. She'd married Dad for his money and status, fully aware that he was capable of cruelty. She'd witnessed how he treated me firsthand. Now she was learning that karma has a way of redistributing ill-gotten gains. The really satisfying news came that afternoon, when Elena's phone rang with updates from the prosecutor's office. They found everything she reported after hanging up. The offshore accounts he'd been using to hide income from the IRS, email communications with shell companies that were helping him manipulate Vail Technologies' stock price, and evidence of at least 6 other investors he'd defrauded over the past decade using similar tactics. 6 other investors. I felt sick. Dad's crimes went far deeper than just stealing from me. Apparently your father has been running variations of this scam for years. He'd bring in investors, use their money to grow the company, then find legal loopholes or create false violations to force them out at below-market rates. You weren't his first victim, Sarah. You were just the one who finally had the resources and motivation to fight back. The knowledge that Dad had been systematically victimizing other people for years crystallized something important for me. This wasn't just about personal revenge anymore. It was about justice for everyone he'd wronged. That evening, I drove to Vail Technologies headquarters for the first time since the night I'd gathered evidence in Dad's office. The building looked the same, but everything felt different. I was no longer sneaking around like a thief in my own family's business. I was walking in as the rightful owner. Margaret, Dad's former secretary, met me in the lobby with tears in her eyes. Miss Vail, Miss Vail, I'm so sorry about everything that's come to light. None of us had any idea what your father was doing. I know, Margaret. And I want you to know that everyone's jobs are safe. The company is going to continue operating under new management. The relief on her face was immediate. What about the Peterson merger? That's dead, obviously. But I've been in discussions with 3 other companies who are interested in partnerships now that Vail Technologies is under ethical leadership. It was true. Elena had fielded calls all day from competitors who suddenly saw opportunities in Dad's downfall. We're also going to be reaching out to the investors Dad defrauded to offer them equity stakes in the restructured company. Margaret's eyes widened. You're giving away ownership to help his victims. I'm making things right. Dad stole from these people using money and resources that should never have been his in the first place. They deserve compensation, and Vail Technologies deserves a fresh start. As word spread through the building that I was taking over operations, employees began approaching me with stories I'd never heard. Stories about Dad's explosive temper, his threats against anyone who questioned his decisions, his pattern of taking credit for other people's work. The man I'd grown up calling father was revealed to be a tyrant who'd ruled the company through fear and manipulation. The most damning story came from Jake Morrison, the head of product development who'd worked for Dad since the company's early days. Your father fired 3 different employees over the past 2 years for asking questions about the Meridian Holdings investment, Jake told me privately in Dad's former office. He claimed they were violating confidentiality agreements, but really he was just paranoid that someone would figure out the connection. Did anyone suspect the truth? Some of us wondered why this mysterious investor never attended board meetings or requested quarterly reports like normal major shareholders. But your father had explanations for everything. Jake paused. Looking back, we should have realized something was wrong when he started talking about problematic investors and cleaning up the shareholder structure. He was planning to steal from you right in front of us. That night alone in what used to be Dad's executive office, I sat behind his massive mahogany desk and tried to process the magnitude of what had happened. In the span of 18 hours, I'd gone from being the invisible daughter serving drinks at a wedding to being the CEO of a $12 million technology company and the key witness in a federal criminal case. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. This is Marcus. I'm allowed 1 phone call before sentencing hearing tomorrow. Can we talk? I stared at the message for a long time before typing back. There's nothing left to say. His response came immediately. I'm still your father. I deleted the message without responding. Marcus Vale might have been my biological father, but he'd forfeited any claim to that relationship the moment he decided to steal from me. The man who'd raised me, who'd taught me to ride a bike and helped with my homework had been revealed as an illusion. The real Marcus Vale was the one who'd handed me a housekeeper's name tag at his own wedding while plotting to commit felonies against me. As I prepared to leave the office, I found a framed photo on Dad's bookshelf that I'd never noticed before. It was a picture of him, Mom, and me from my college graduation, all of us smiling and looking genuinely happy. For a moment, I felt a pang of grief for the family I'd thought we were. But then I remembered Mom's final words about wanting me to see what kind of man my father really was. She'd known this day would come, and she'd prepared me for it. This wasn't about destroying a loving father. It was about stopping a criminal who happened to share my DNA. Tomorrow would bring sentencing hearings, media interviews, and the complex work of rebuilding Vale Technologies into the ethical company it should have always been. But tonight I allowed myself to feel something I hadn't experienced in years: pride in my own strength and satisfaction in a job well done. 6 months later, I stood in the same conference room where Dad used to hold his executive meetings, but everything had changed. The walls that once displayed his awards and accolades now featured photos of our expanded team and recognition for Vale Technologies' new corporate ethics initiatives. Where his mahogany throne had once dominated the space, I'd installed a round conference table that encouraged collaboration rather than intimidation. The Q3 numbers are incredible. Elena announced, reviewing the quarterly report she'd helped prepare in her new role as our Chief Financial Officer. Revenue is up 37%. And we've successfully compensated all 6 of your father's previous victims through equity stakes in the company. Around the table sat the management team I'd assembled, people who shared my vision of business as a force for positive change rather than personal enrichment. Jake Morrison had been promoted to Chief Technology Officer. Margaret now served as Director of Human Resources, using her decades of experience to create the supportive workplace culture Dad had never bothered to foster. And most surprisingly, Rosa, the catering worker who'd shown me kindness on Dad's wedding night, had accepted my offer to head our new corporate social responsibility division. "What's the latest on the criminal proceedings?" asked Sarah Chen, our new head of legal. No relation to Dad's disgraced former attorney who was serving his own prison sentence for conspiracy. Marcus Vale was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison yesterday, Sarah reported. The judge called his crimes a profound betrayal of family trust and investor confidence. Richard Chen received 4 years for his role in the conspiracy. Both men will be required to pay full restitution to their victims, though the amounts exceed their remaining assets. 8 years. It felt both like justice and like a lifetime. Dad would be 70 when he was released, assuming he served his full sentence. The empire he'd spent decades building was now thriving under the leadership of the daughter he'd tried to erase. There's something else, Sarah continued. Vivian Blackwood, she's gone back to her maiden name, has requested a meeting. Apparently she has information about additional offshore accounts your father maintained. I wasn't surprised. Vivian had proven to be a survivor, and cooperating with authorities was likely her final attempt to distance herself from Dad's crimes. The divorce had been finalized within 60 days, leaving her with exactly what her prenup specified, essentially nothing beyond her personal belongings and the car she'd owned before the marriage. Set up the meeting, I decided. If she has information that helps us recover stolen funds, it's worth hearing her out. After the team meeting ended, I found myself alone in my office. The same space Dad had used to plan my financial destruction. His personal items had been removed months ago, replaced by plants, family photos that actually included me and the framed business ethics certificate I'd earned in Mom's memory. My phone buzzed with a text from an old college friend, saw the Forbes article about Vail Technologies being named Company of the Year for corporate turnaround. So proud of you. The Forbes recognition had been unexpected but deeply satisfying. The article, titled From Family Betrayal to Business Triumph, How Serafina Vail Rebuilt Her Father's Empire, had generated interview requests from business schools wanting to use our story as a case study in ethical leadership. But the most meaningful recognition had come from an unexpected source. Last week, I'd received a handwritten letter from Dr. Patricia Morrison, the oncologist who'd treated Mom during her final months. Your mother often spoke about her hopes for your future, Doctor, Morrison had written. She said you had the intelligence to succeed in business and the character to do it honorably. I think she would be proud to see how you've transformed a terrible betrayal into an opportunity to help others. The letter had made me cry for the first time since Dad's arrest. Not tears of sadness or anger, but tears of gratitude for a mother who'd loved me enough to prepare me for the worst while believing I was strong enough to create something better. My reflection was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Elena entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the satisfied expression she got whenever she'd uncovered particularly good news. I just got off the phone with the prosecutor handling the Peterson Industries investigation, she announced, settling into the chair across from my desk. Turns out your father's attempt to defraud you wasn't his only crime involving that merger. He'd also been manipulating Vail Technologies' financial reports to make the company appear less profitable than it actually was. Why would he do that? To justify selling to Peterson at below market value. He would have made millions on the merger, while Peterson got Vail Technologies for roughly half what it was actually worth. Elena shook her head in amazement. Even when he was committing crimes against you, he was planning to commit crimes against Peterson Industries too. The scope of Dad's greed continued to astound me. He hadn't just wanted to steal my shares, he'd wanted to steal value from every legitimate investor, every employee, and every business partner who trusted him. There's more, Elena continued. The prosecutor wants to know if you'd be willing to testify at the congressional hearing on corporate fraud next month. Your case has become the poster child for why we need stronger protections for whistleblowers and minority shareholders. The idea of testifying before Congress would have terrified me a year ago. Now it felt like an opportunity to ensure that other daughters and sons wouldn't face the same betrayal I'd endured. Set it up, I said. If our story can prevent other families from being destroyed by corporate greed, I'm willing to tell it. That evening I drove to the cemetery where Mom was buried. I'd been visiting her grave regularly since Dad's arrest, updating her on the progress of rebuilding both the company and my life. The conversations were one-sided, obviously, but they helped me feel connected to the wisdom she'd shared during her final months. I think you'd like the team I've put together, I said, arranging fresh flowers on her headstone. Margaret sends her regards, by the way. She said you always treated the support staff with more respect than Dad ever did. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves overhead, and for a moment, I could almost hear Mom's voice reminding me that family isn't just about blood relations. It's about the people who choose to love and support you when times get difficult. As I prepared to leave, my phone rang with a call from Jake Morrison. Sarah, you need to see the news. Someone leaked your congressional testimony preparation materials to the press. Is that bad? Are you kidding? The headlines are calling you the daughter who chose justice over blood. Your story is inspiring other corporate whistleblowers to come forward. 3 major cases have been filed just today by family members exposing white-collar crimes. I smiled as I walked back to my car. Mom had been right about so many things, but especially about this. Sometimes the greatest act of love for your family is refusing to enable their worst impulses. Dad had taught me what kind of person I never wanted to become. Mom had given me the tools to build something better. And now, 6 months after the worst betrayal of my life, I was leading a company that proved business could be both profitable and ethical. The little girl who'd been handed a housekeeper's name tag at her father's wedding had become a woman who refused to accept that cruelty and greed were inevitable parts of success. That transformation, I realized, was the sweetest revenge of all. So what do you think? Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and doing what's right? Maybe you've witnessed workplace injustice or family betrayal that made you question everything you believed about the people closest to you. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life tales of justice, karma, and the courage it takes to stand up for yourself when the people who should protect you become the ones you need protection from. Share this with someone who needs to remember that blood doesn't excuse betrayal and that sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the family you're born into. Thank you for watching, and remember, you're stronger than you know, and you deserve better than anyone who tries to diminish your worth. Until next time, keep fighting for the justice you deserve.